Hi and welcome. John Avlon is a prolific columnist and commentator, often seen on CNN, a former editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, the author of several remarkable books, one of which is on the wall there, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. He was also chief speechwriter for Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
Before he was crazy.
I'm sorry. Can I pitch in?
Hold on. John is lucky enough to be married to our next panelist, Margaret Hoover.
I get it.
She is a conservative political commentator for CNN, the host of Firing Line on PBS, and the author of a really interesting book, American Individualism: How a Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party.
Also slightly outdated.
She is also the great-granddaughter of President Herbert Hoover.
Awesome.
Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize winner, now an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, formerly the deputy editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, and the author of America in Retreat: The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. He is neither a relative nor married to a relative of a former American president. Let me start with a broad question. I'll start down at the end with John. Okay. How has the changed and changing media ecosystem shaped the coverage, the content, and the outcomes of presidential elections?
So we're going to start small. Look, it obviously is fundamental. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, for example, if you didn't have social media and its algorithms, you wouldn't have had President Donald Trump. And what you have is a obviously fragmented media environment, driven, if not dominated, by partisan media outlets, and algorithms on social media, which are geared towards elevating the most confrontational, conspiracy theorist, extreme voices. All of that makes it exponentially more difficult to reason together as citizens of a democratic republic. So it's not that we need to be wistful about the days of, Walter Cronkite and that's the way it is, but we do need to recognize that that combination, that toxic combination of hyper-partisan media, social media, fragmentation, declining business models of media, news deserts, which are the death of local media, and the sort of proliferation of disinformation has all conspired to make it exponentially more difficult to do our job as citizens, which is agree on a common set of facts and then try to find common ground and reason together. So I don't think you can understand our fragmented media environment without dealing with media and the fragmentation of media.
Margaret?
Well, I would associate myself with most of those comments. I would quibble with the point that if there hadn't been social media, Donald Trump wouldn't have been reelected. I think that was certainly, and we know the evidence of the Russian troll farms and the real operation from outside actors to influence the election. But we also know that that was part of, I think, a very perfect storm that got us Donald Trump in the first place. We had a historically unpopular, first-time historic female candidate. On the other side, there was a real populist uprising economically that I think our elites hadn't paid attention to or acknowledged up to that point. There was a little bit of a gamble, I think, from a lot of folks who thought, well, let's just try it and see how it goes. And then there were the market incentives, I think, of the media that were not just social media driven, but also this is a market-based economy. If you are going to have more viewers and sell more ads with the next outrageous thing that Donald Trump said, and then he knows that he can say an even more outrageous thing and keep the spotlight on him, and then the front page of the New York Times is going to cover it, sorry, Brett, and then CNN will go wall to wall with it. We have this building ecosystem that just drove coverage in his direction, and I think that enormously benefited him. And I think the challenge in this go around is to cover him in a completely different way. Not just as a normal candidate. I mean, the real question is, has the media learned the lesson of how to cover Donald Trump in a way that will be, and I think we know the answer is no, but then the pivot, the flip side is, what should it be? And how do we need to cover Donald Trump?
Brett?
Let me begin by actually thanking everyone in this audience for
That was
being
so
such
clappy.
incredibly engaged readers. For us, it's just such an honor to be able to share a stage with people like you who care as deeply as you do about the things we care about and read with us. Look, I think Donald Trump has no greater ally in the media than what is called the mainstream media. We are his dupes and his willing accomplices. We is a big word, so I'm not sure that applies to absolutely everyone, but by and large, we dance to the tune that he wants to play by eliciting a degree of outrage that often doesn't correspond necessarily with the perceived offense, but also by providing him with an argument which is frankly not such a bad argument, which is that the media, the so-called mainstream media, in the past 10 or 20 years has become a highly ideological, highly partisan media, stuffed with adjectives that should have no place in straight news coverage, riddled with so-called news analysis, which is essentially a matter of opinion writing on the news pages. And so when Trump rails against the media, or the mainstream media, a lot of Americans nod their head in sympathy because there's something to that allegation. And I think that if anyone gets Donald Trump elected, or dare I say reelected this year, those of us who think we oppose him in the mainstream media will bear some of the blame. I remember after 2016, and his surprise victory, some mainstream editors said we really didn't understand the country, we didn't appreciate it. So what did they do? They thought, we have a great idea. Let's hire a bunch of never-Trumpers like Bret Stephens. Like, that was the wrong idea. I mean, I'm happy to have my job, but that was the wrong idea. And I'm afraid this year again, we will have failed to learn a lesson we should have learned 8 years ago.
So I'm going to build off something that you've all alluded to. What you've just said, what Margaret said. There's an intensifying dispute about the proper role of journalists, given that we live in a time when Daniel Patrick Moynihan's adage no longer seems to apply, that we're all entitled to our own opinions but not our own facts. For example, 2/3 of Iowa Republican caucus attendees said that the 2020 election was illegitimate, that Trump actually won. It's not true, but it's not atypical. Now, people have heard the claims of a stolen election repeated over and over and over again, and other claims of the same kind that are equally false. Should journalists just report what a candidate and his supporters say, or to what extent, and this is being argued more and more, I think, should journalists characterize certain claims as false, especially when so many people believe that democracy is on the line?
Look, that Daniel Patrick Moynihan quote, everyone's entitled to their own opinion but not their own facts, needs to apply. To me, it is the key quote still of our times. Is it under attack? Yes. That's exactly why we need to assert it. You know, in any news organization, you know, there should be clear delineation between the news pages, the opinion pages, and the editorial. I started out as a columnist, then I became an editor-in-chief, and I've been at CNN the last few years as an anchor and analyst. I think the things that columnists can do, providing context, fact-checking, they are core responsibilities of journalism. Why? Because at the end of the day, the center we strive for is facts. It is truth. That's the North Star. And I think Brett makes a good point about news analysis and verbs and adjectives, and that's fair. And everyone's got a point of grievance, right? We could do the history of where right-wing media started being created. It was the perceived implicit liberal bias of the mainstream media that led Roger Ailes and others to say we need explicit conservative bias, but we will sell it as fair and balanced. But I'll go back even further, to the coverage of Senator McCarthy. That was where reporters began to understand that no, you cannot simply report whatever a demagogue says uncritically, right? There needs to be context around it. Just because somebody says it in a position of power It may be news, but that doesn't make it true, and sometimes it's not even news. And therefore, that's an additional responsibility of journalism and democracy. I think journalists should have a pro-democracy bias at home and abroad, right? So take a note from the failures of Walter Duranty back in the day. That's an old school reference. But also apply it to our own times today. Try not to be, when I ran the Daily Beast, I said we should be nonpartisan but not neutral, right? No one's got a monopoly on virtue or vice. We should try to understand the good faith arguments and perspectives people have. We should try to find common ground, but let's not play false moral equivalence on issues of facts. That does not elevate the debate in a democracy and make a more informed citizenry, which at the end of the day is what we're supposed to be doing in large part.
Margaret, would you quibble with that?
No, I would broaden it though. What I would also say is there's some education for the public, right? There's a public education around media and media's role. And against the broad backdrop of journalism, I think you have three different kinds of journalists here on this stage. I mean, John Avlon has been an editor-in-chief in a newsroom where he's been assigning stories and trying to sort of get a whole cadre of people to get to the truth. And Brett has been a columnist, whereby he has an opinion, but he has also, it's a reported column, right? It has his opinion, but it also has facts. And you can read it and you can distinguish between the two and you can make your own judgment. And my television program, I mean, I am not a journalist in training like these two guys have been for 25 years. I backed into this 5 years ago and have an interview program that also endeavors to elucidate the truth, even though my background came from the center right, and I try to be very clear about that. I mean, the program's firing line, guy. I mean, it's like William F. Buckley Jr.'s pedigree, and so it's very clear to the audience what it is. The host is from a center right perspective, but it's not my platform to make my point my point. It's, I view my role against the broad backdrop of journalism as an interviewer that's intending to elucidate the truth. And I think there's sometimes confusion when you have talking heads on television spouting, there's just a blurring of the lines, I think, and that can be confusing, I think, to the public as well.
Brett, is there an additional responsibility given the era we live in?
I think our responsibility in at least the news business, there's a twofold responsibility. Among my colleagues who are reporters, the responsibility is to be what we used to call objective, accurate, fair, comprehensive, balanced, and discriminating about what we choose to include and what's of use to the reader. In the opinion section, the responsibility is to be honest. Mm-hmm. You read me, you can agree or disagree, but I'm coming from an honest place. This is what I think. I think one of the problems that we have in the media is that we have news reporters who are not objective because they're seeking something other than just the facts. They're seeking, quote, moral clarity as they see it. And I have to say, we have in the commentariat a fair amount of commentary which I don't think is honest. I don't think it's coming from a place of genuine sincerity, because people are engaged in what's called preference falsification and saying things they don't believe because I think they're afraid to be candid. So we have a real problem in the news media, and my advice always when it comes to these discussions is, first of all, physician, heal thyself. Mm-hmm. Heal thyself. We're not out there to remedy the problems of democracy. We have a very defined function. We are an organ in a broader system of democracy. Maybe we're the heart, maybe we're the bloodstream, maybe we're the lungs, something else. But when we get outside of our lane and try to tell the unwashed masses what democracy is, we're running into trouble. We're doing our readers no favors, and we're doing ourselves no favors. I want NGOs, political parties, candidates, great statesmen and stateswomen, Senator Barbara Boxer right there, to be the ones who are in that business, right? But our business is somewhat different, and I think we have been failing at this for 25 years, and I think the Trump presidency and the populism that you're seeing not only in the United States but abroad is largely a reaction to that, if I may say, elite self-satisfaction and self-delusion.
So
Yeah, let me just add something to that. So, what we talk about the fragmentation of media, and part of it is we don't have gatekeepers the way we did, Okay, that's a form and function problem. I think that increases the need to strengthen guardrails. And it is not any one person's job to maintain guardrails. It's frankly the citizenry's job, but journalists play a part in that. And that means insisting upon a fact-based debate, because otherwise we can't reason together. I think the Physician Hill thyself point is particularly appropriate when news organizations need to sort of check their own biases, some of which may be, for example, understanding urban perspectives, but not rural perspectives as much, treating some beliefs as sacrosanct, or as the rise of illiberalism we see, which manifests on the right and in some cases on the left, there can be a fear that fuses even into the opinion pages for saying something that you feel will create major blowback. Now, if you're a columnist, you really should have thicker skin than that, but that itself can put subtle spin on the ball. I think we shouldn't engage in moral equivalence about the asymmetric polarization, but we need to understand that feedback loop. And part of, I think, the job of journalists with integrity is to stand up against a mob, any mob of the moment, because that's part and parcel with liberal values, it seems to me. And that's something, I mean, in a way that transcends partisanship and ideology. And I think those are the kinds of North Stars that we can aim for, however imperfectly.
Well, let me follow up that North Star. Imagine it's 1962 when the main gatekeepers were the New York Times, CBS, NBC, to a lesser extent ABC. The Washington Post had not yet assumed the role that it would soon assume. If a young producer had gone to the Dean of Television News, Walter Cronkite, and said, look, there's a group called the John Birch Society. They're holding a press conference today to charge that President Eisenhower was, quote, a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy, and President Kennedy, quote, induced weaklings in Congress to approve treasonable acts. How many cameras should we send, Mr. Cronkite? Cronkite would have looked up and offered a two-word answer, you're fired. But today, think, for example, of birtherism and Barack Obama. Given all this media proliferation that you've talked about and social media, what once would have been on the fringe can now quickly enter into the public dialogue in very prominent ways. Were we better off when we had these gatekeepers determining what was newsworthy? Did that deter, at least to some extent, major party candidates from propagating conspiracy theories? Or are we better off with the free-for-all that we have now? Brett, you want to start?
Well, we were better off when Walter Cronkite was the gatekeeper. It depends on who the gatekeeper is. I mean, that's the essential problem. I mean, you had...
So you do believe they're in the gatekeepers?
Yes, of course I believe in the gatekeepers, and we have to, look, those statements from the Birchers, they should have been subject to scrutiny and examination, and of course, they were. You have that wonderful essay on the paranoid style in American politics is inspired by the John Birch Society and the conspiracy theory. But one of the roles of the gatekeepers is also to maintain a sense of proportion and the interests of the readers. I mean, the amount of coverage that was given over to the mythical P-tape, right, was a scandal in the media. It was an absolute scandal. First of all, because guess what? It wasn't true. There's no P-tape. It's never been found. It's just it's a scurrilous and salacious allegation. But it wound up creating an element of profound, and I have to say justified mistrust in the so-called gatekeepers, and I guess coming from the Times, that's one of the gatekeepers, because we kept, if not the P-tape, the broader set of allegations, which were never proved, we kept obsessing about this subject. And it made us seem like we were partisans, or at least cheerleaders, to what was another conspiracy theory. It was just a conspiracy theory that happened to match our own, in my view, well-founded prejudice to hate this guy, right? So anything said about him, his hookers pee on Barack Obama's bed, all this stuff, fine, it's got to be true because he's a bad dude. So anything against him is worth saying. So we failed at that. I mean, when I say we, again, I'm generalizing, and I see Adam Nagorny in the back there. Hi, Adam. This is off the record, sort of.
I think
He's
it's on
covering us for
television.
the time.
Oh, well, never mind. I'm fired. I don't think we did I don't think we did as good a job as we should have in maintaining a sense of proportion about the allegations and keeping our eye on the ball and what mattered to normal readers of, well, maybe not normal readers of the Times, but to the American public.
So, Margaret, who will guard the guards?
Well,
Who will
I mean-
keep the gates so that the gatekeepers are doing their job?
I think Brett's first instinct answer, which is depends who the gatekeepers are,
Yeah.
is incredibly important. And I think it's just with the concept of the Birch Society, I mean, it took serious people studying who it is and what it was for 5, 10 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, and even William F. Buckley Jr., who was the central pillar of the modern American conservative movement, called out the Birchers as being a radical conspiracy theorists who were who were up to no good. So it didn't even have to be a gatekeeper, but it had to be somebody who was respected with a following, who had a reputation for honesty, even though he had an opinion. And frankly, he is most accredited in many ways, particularly on the right, right? What you're seeing as much as anything is this hyperpolarization of a media market. And Buckley was the one who was able to shut the crazies out on the right effectively. And this is sort of at the beginning of our factionalized political media sort of silos. So to this question of, is it better to have 3 networks rather than 2,000, if you consider sort of the TikTok streams and the Instagram channels? And the
Everybody
YouTube
can
channels?
have their own network.
They can, but who do you listen to and who gets a following? And then the Joe Rogans of the world propagate the conspiracy theories, and you have the Birchers show up there to give their thing. I mean, not actually the Birchers on Joe Rogan's show, but versions of that in an updated. So there's a balance.
Yeah, so look, I wrote a book called Wingnuts over a decade ago, and it was
Way
Is
ahead of
this
your
about,
time.
is this about Boeing? Or was that door nuts?
it's about a minor league team in Wichita, Kansas, actually called the Wingnuts. No, it was out of my reporting as a young columnist. It was twofold. The early days of the Obama administration, tracking the conspiracy theories and their echoes that were emerging. For example, folks might not remember this, but there were calls for massive resistance to when Obama was elected. And of course, that phrase was interesting because at least consciously or subconsciously, that happened to be the rallying slogan of the white citizens' councils in reaction to desegregation in the late 60s. And you saw, if you listen to Glenn Beck at the time, there's a lot of Bircher-esque elements. But there was an ongoing debate at that time. Are we elevating the crazy people? Or am I, doing a segment called Wingnut of the Week? Is that elevating the crazies? I thought I was chronicling a movement that was edging into the mainstream. I didn't, that became the Tea Party movement, and now here we are. I do think that ignoring that is no longer an option. I do think that there is an artificial amplification of those voices, though, that we need to take seriously. Because, look, the exit polls you mentioned, I mean, 2/3 of Iowa, one of the most educated states in the country per capita, 2/3 of those Republican caucus goers said the election was stolen, this is a breakdown of our ability to reason together. That's really, really core, but it's because of the fragmentation of hyperpartisan media and the way that corrupts people, right? We talk a lot about the incentive structures that are corrupting to members of Congress, closed partisan primaries, and the rest of it. I mean, in the wake of January 6th, we now know, because the text messages at Fox News, that people knew what was the truth, but they were actively propagating lies, in part because they were afraid of losing market share to their further right competitors who were amplifying those lies. So that's part of the ecosystem that we need to deal with. And the answer is we need to insist on a fact-based debate. There needs to be accountability. I don't think we can ignore the crazy in our politics, but we desperately need to call it out. And what Margaret made about Bill Buckley is what we're missing. We need more people on the right, in this case, policing their own extremes. And the left's got to do it too. About the outbreaks of anti-Semitism on some far left fringe, but that takes on a bullying amplification on college campuses. Let's not play moral equivalence with that that stuff either. So that's a role that I think people need to take more seriously in media, as citizens and as politicians, because lest we forget, we're all kind of in this together. And that's one thing we need to remember a lot more.
Well, how do we get more fact-based debate? I mean, what are the incentives? How do we do this?
Well, one thing that I think is missing from our public culture is in fact debate. I was a contributor on MSNBC for a number of years, and pretty much every single panel was the same. Trump is terrible. No, he's worse than terrible. No. He's so much worse than terrible. That was the nature.
That could have been fact-based.
That's not the point, okay?
I know. I couldn't resist.
The point is simply this. If you live in MSNBC land, you'll get one note, okay? And if you live in Fox land, you'll get one note. And, to quote Raising Arizona, honey, there's what's rotten, never the twain shall meet. Never the twain did these two points of view meet. They didn't encounter one another. We're living side by side, but without an actual encounter or collision of views. And one of the things that I think is astonishing that's really missing in our public culture are opportunities, if not to debate, at least to converse. I do this thing in the Times. I have this conversation with my pal, Gail Collins.
Yep.
I mean, and we're friends in real life. She's very dear to me. If you look for our conversation on social media, it is nowhere. Social media doesn't mention my conversation with Gail because it doesn't fit the algorithm of outrage that they're looking for.
That's right.
And yet, it is, I think, by orders of magnitude, at least according to some measures, one of the most popular columns in the Times, because people are looking for agreeable disagreement. They're looking for an encounter of different views. They're looking for a sense that we actually, to John's point, still belong to one country and we can still talk to one another.
Margaret.
That's what.
It's interesting. There have, what you're talking about is a contest of ideas.
Yeah.
Right, to really see what
Or
the
at least
inflection
at
points
least
in the
a
argument.
touching,
That is collegial and demonstrates that we can do that, which, by the way, we can't. I mean, the Congress is paralyzed because they can't even be in the same room. The Republicans don't even, anyway, don't get me started. Okay, so here's what I think about this. I think we just have to start doing it. Like, in the places that you're doing it at the Times, and people love seeing you and Gail debate. I'm starting a forum at Hofstra University in the coming weeks where I have actually, Republicans who are really advocating for a Trump 2.0 because they want the policies, and then Republicans who are advocating against Trump because they're concerned it will undermine our democratic institutions. And we're having a moderated conversation about these questions. Is Trump 2.0 really worse than Biden 2.0, but from a Republican perspective? I mean, I think there's a real wedge there. So, the idea is that we just have to start doing it. And again, the algorithms, you're right, are going to fight against us. There's IQ squared debates, which have now turned into a podcast called Open to Debate. If you haven't listened to it, I think you've participated on one.
Many,
Recently, though, I think about this question of objectivity in newsrooms.
Yeah.
And these are fantastic. And so you can start to find them, and I think perhaps the market will bear it out.
Firing line?
Well, on my program does it, but it's fortunately not driven by market incentives.
Yeah.
Look, that's what we're trying to do at the USC Center for the Political Future, where Senator Boxer's been a fellow and Brett has been a guest, and we have real conversations between people who strongly disagree with each other, but they're not throwing dinner rolls at each other. And I think it's very tough to see how you you got to do this one brick at a time.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you're going to get this done.
But we have to model it, right? And you'll find that there actually is a pent-up demand. The algorithms are working against it, right? And that's a big part of the problem. What's getting surfaced is the most extreme voices, right? And then that's what gets monetized. And people are going for narrow but intense niche audiences, so they try to keep them addicted to anger and resentment. I do think, though, that there's also a point about a balanced news diet, and I think when people sort of skirt along the surface and do outrage du jour coverage that all tends to be on one topic, naturally people tune out. I think, you know, if there was actually sort of a more balanced diet of perspectives and stories, I think that would attract folks. I'm old school about the old high-low editorial point of view. I think that draws people in. I think it needs to be less focused on the horse race and more on the stakes or the underlying policy debates, which don't need to taste like medicine. I mean, those are things the media can do and should do, but frequently the incentives are driven by sort of short-term considerations.
Can I add one point here? I mean, it's also on you all.
Yeah.
And in this sense, like, it's always nice someone comes up to me and says, oh, you know, I think you're such a terrific columnist, and I agree with you 98% of the time. Like, whether I'm a good columnist or not has nothing to do with whether you agree with me or not. My morning news diet begins by reading Paul Krugman and gnashing my teeth and then going on from there. But I'm learning from them. Mm-hmm. I'm learning what they have to say, how they think, why they reach the conclusions they do. And my thinking is, it'll make me a better exponent of my position to actually understand what the opposing view is. You know, I sometimes read letters, reader responses to my column, and it reminds me of a quip by the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. He once reproved a very bad student. He said, "You're not even wrong." It doesn't even, the arguments don't even rise to the level of wrongness because they're not engaging with what I'm saying. And this has happened, there's a plague of this, right? So
yes.
It requires, like a healthy democracy requires an active citizenry. Yeah. A healthy news media requires an active readership that is engaging in an intelligent way, often with views with which they do not agree. And we have to cultivate the art of disagreement, because the art of disagreement fundamentally is the art of democracy.
John?
Let me add that. That's exactly right. And by the way, there's a great effort out west. A bunch of members of the National Governors Association, Gerald Polis and Spencer Cox, are starting an initiative called Disagree Better, right? You know, encouraging civil debate and conversation. Obviously, this is sort of blowing against the wind, but that's the point. The other thing about your responsibility is, you know, we can monetize what folks watch, and it is easier to monetize. First of all, it's hard to monetize hard news. People will track celebrity gossip and scandal. Okay, what does that do? That creates the incentive to create more of it. And then what's really easy to monetize is like sports and entertainment. And that there's another word for that in another era called bread and circuses, right? And so these larger factors are absolutely in place, and it is up for people to vote with their eyeballs as well as their wallets to show that there's a market demand and opportunity for something different. The real thing I'm most worried about right now, I've started to see on social media, there's a trendy term called news diet, right? And it's this sort of pseudo self-empowering thing. I'm putting myself on a news diet. I'm no longer watching the news, right? And I understand it's part of the residual effects of what Steve Bannon calls flooding the zone with shit, right? Just make civic debate seem so toxic and so unappealing and so exhausting that good, normal people tune out. They say that public sphere, that's a mess. I'm not getting involved. But what that does is it seeds the public sphere to the people who don't mind wading through the shit. And that's the larger danger. We are in a war on apathy right now. I'm very concerned that folks are actively tuning out the news for reasons of mental health at precisely the time they should be tuning in more, because the democracy actually is at stake. You know, and there's a challenge of lies and facts in fundamental ways. We talked about this earlier. Election litmus test is a test of loyalty for an entire political party, most of whose members know better. That's not acceptable, you know, if we are going to be a self-governing people. And so I think that we need to take this idea of pushing back against apathy very seriously, because this is all happening right now. Oh, let's tune out. Let's not pay attention. It's too messy. It's too at exactly the wrong time for our democratic republic.
Let's talk for a minute about another group that has a responsibility here, the candidates. FDR, JFK, Ronald Reagan, to cite some examples, connected powerfully with people in ways that were often eloquent, generally eloquent, and sought to elevate the national conversation. Today, the coin of the campaign trail frequently seems to be the crude and the rude and base appeals to the public dialogue, and that attracts clicks. That sets the logarithms just happily vibrating. Is that the new normal? And does our current media ecosystem encourage it? Or is it going to prove to be a passing phenomenon? Anyway, go ahead.
Look, I taught a course at the University of Chicago a few years ago. It was called The Art of Political Rhetoric, from Pericles' funeral oration to Donald Trump's tweets.
That's quite a span.
The graph looked like this. Although, if you actually pay attention to Donald Trump's tweets, there is a method and a kind of sinister genius to them, because what they communicate fundamentally is this kind of corrosive cynicism that weirdly builds trust in an audience that thinks it's seeing through the same lies that Trump is seeing through. And there is an opportunity, and I don't know if President Biden can seize it, but I hope someone can. There is an opportunity for great democratic political rhetoric. It's what's missing. I think it's actually what's missing from his presidency. I look at a lot of the policies of the Biden administration. I couldn't feel more strongly in favor of them, particularly his stand on Ukraine, coming to the defense of Israel when it needed it most. But by and large, the rhetoric has been missing. And so he is not communicating to millions of Americans who are persuadables the reasons why we need to be engaged in the world against the new not so new, Putin's been in power 25 years, but against this era of authoritarianism, why American leadership matters in the world, why it matters for us to have an open and not a closed society, leaving aside questions of control over the border, why we should be a nation of immigrants, why we care about being an opportunity society. And I'm waiting for the Democratic leader, and I don't have much hope anymore in the Republican Party, but a small d Democratic leader who can start to communicate these great ideas. Because when you look at the most successful statesmanship, and no one knows this better than John over the last 250 years, it wasn't just policymakers. It wasn't people who had a good policy. It was people who communicated great ideas in ringing ways that meant something to those and changed the nature of the people who were in the audience, as the people at Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863 were changed.
Yeah, I've long argued, actually, that one of the measures of greatness in a president is whether that president enlarges America's conception of itself and raises our vision.
Yes.
John, you did this professionally, and then we'll turn to Margaret, and then I'm saving 1 minute for a bonus question.
I did. I mean, and for those of y'all who booed with the Rudy Giuliani thing, I worked with him before he was crazy. Second of all, but I was with him during 9/11, and I wrote the eulogies for 343 firefighters and 37 police officers and those who were murdered. There is absolutely a need for leadership that unites us and elevates our debates. My last two books were, one is Washington's farewell address, the other is Lincoln, the Fight for Peace, the core of which is about the second inaugural, which is sort of a New Testament speech in the last paragraph about national reconciliation after war. Those are very high bars, but it is really important that we aspire to that. You can be a uniting leader in a divided time. It's vitally important we have that. It also requires having leaders who remind us, and citizens who insist upon it, that we remember there's more than unites us than divides us as Americans. the tribalism and the meanness and the grievance and the bitterness that has suffused our politics and turned fellow citizens against one another is a textbook example of how democracies die. You go back and look at what the Founding Fathers worried about and warned about in Washington's farewell address and organized the Constitutional Convention to try to avoid. It's this. And that is not to say that we are a nation in decline. In difficult times is exactly when we need to get some swagger back and have confidence in our country and in ourselves. But it requires rising above our most petty, bitter grievances. And the ecosystem right now is not helping us do it. And we as citizens should not wait for someone else to come along and save us. That's the whole point of self-government. We got to do it with ourselves, and then the leaders will follow and new leaders will emerge. Media is an important part of this, but so's you demanding something better and showing that there's an opportunity for it that will be rewarded.
Margaret, and
I
save
just have
me
a
a couple
small, I
minutes.
just
Save
have
me a couple minutes.
I fundamentally agree with you, John Avlon.
Thanks, babe.
I think, look, you cited in the question the power of communications and having the largest platform in the world if you're the president of the United States. And then you said FDR, Kennedy, Reagan. I would add to that Obama. You know,
Oh, sure.
individuals, right? Not that you left him out intentionally, but these are 4 individuals in the 20th century. They're not the majority, right? This is a rare confluence of events where you get an individual who can articulate a vision, aspirational vision, that is able to navigate the party process and then ascend to create this kind of vision and really transform their party in the meantime. And everybody, we remember Obama sort of answering, I think to the extent that every new candidate or person who has this ability is sort of answering a thirst from a previous era, right? Obama's one is, we are not red states or blue states, we are the United States, right? Was coming out of a very divisive end of a long 8 years and 2 wars and floods of the Bush administration. And so, look, it's rare. It is not the majority. It is fewer, and it's the exception, not the rule.
But it is, even if you're not talking about the folks you've mentioned, there are other presidents who might not have been as eloquent, but they wouldn't talk in the rude and crude ways that we've heard in recent years.
In some ways, he's the flip side of that. I mean, Trump is sort of the flip side of that. He is catalyzing and codifying a group of people, a movement, and a party around being the antithesis of sort of the optimistic vision that we strive for.
And that would be, in my view at least, very bad for America if it prevailed over time.
But I do think it's passing because it's about the individuals, right?
Well, I hope you're right.
coming-
Now, I only have 1 minute and 58 seconds left.
Lightning.
And they turn the mic off.
All right.
And that's how they enforce this.
Okay.
So I want to thank John, Margaret, and Brett for a terrific conversation. And I have wait a minute. I have a bonus question for John Avlon.
Oh.
Because you just referred to it. What in the world happened to Rudolph Giuliani?
Wait,
Fine.
we're the living legacy.
Fine. Look, here's the short answer. I think it's a great object lesson for the way that Rudy used to say and believe that to be locked into partisan politics doesn't permit you to think clearly. I always loved that quote. He got locked into partisan politics and he stopped thinking clearly. And that, I think, is the degree to which the appeal of Donald Trump, that tribal appeal of divide to conquer, distorts even good people and good minds. And there are other factors at work here, too.
There are other factors.
Some of which it would be irresponsible for me to speculate on as a non-medical professional on in an audience.
The flip side?
But there's a real tragedy here, too. And it involves when you get locked into partisan politics and desperate for attention and find ways that you're going to benefit from dividing. All those folks, I mean, trial by combat. I mean, the rationalization that resulted in an attempt to overturn our democracy that ended up drawing in hyper-partisans, and hyper-partisan media is the greatest object lesson.
But something good happened. I met my
Oh,
husband,
we met.
and
John-
our children are the living legacy of Rudy Giuliani's presidential aspiration.
There's so much more than that.
Okay,
There's
they're going
so
to
much
turn the mic off. You guys are a great audience. Thank you.